The Ukrainian army has shifted the weight and strategic focus of the war largely to the southern front lines. But in recent days, the epicenter of fighting is not the vast steppes of Zaporizhia or Mariupol that everyone has been watching for weeks. The most critical encounters are now shifting to the island zone spreading across the Dnipro and Kherson Delta. Russian forces encountered an unexpected situation on this strategic line. The Russian Army's 61st Naval Infantry Brigade and elements attached to the 98th Guards Airborne Division were patrolling with boats at the river crossings between Kherson and Oleshky. The 61st Naval Infantry in particular was attempting to pressure Ukrainian units across the river from Oleshky by trying amphibious landings with boats day and night. But the units bearing this pressure from the Russian-occupied zone were perhaps unaware of what was about to happen to them while cruising the river. Because within a short time, FPV drones, artillery, and mortar fire would pass over the heads of Russian naval infantry patrolling between Kherson and Oleshky. And simultaneously, soldiers of Ukraine's 34th Brigade would go after Russian naval infantry with small boats through this critical river delta. In other words, at this island junction between Kherson and Oleshky, a small but strategic zone, far more than expected was about to happen. It all began when Ukraine's 34th Separate Marine Brigade completed all preparations and entered the field. Russian units located on the river route extending to Oleshky, which the Kremlin has held under iron-fisted occupation since 2022, had been monitored by UAVs for a long time. The operational area was highly complex. In this dangerous and mine-filled zone, exactly 4 critical islands were marked on maps as primary targets. These islands are absolutely not ordinary landmasses known in military literature. We're talking about risky areas where conventional infantry tactics completely fail and where mechanized units could never set foot. Looking at maps and intelligence reports, the infiltration and capture of these island zones by Ukrainian units initially appeared to be a nearly impossible mission. But thick fog and rain descending on the area provided the perfect concealment screen the Ukrainian Marines were waiting for. Specially trained units moved into action just before first light, with small tactical boats equipped with extremely quiet engines. The Ukrainian Marines first infiltrated Oleksiivskyi Island like ghosts, neutralizing Russian observation posts there. After this initial shock, the operation cascaded wave by wave to Krulikov, Korabeliv, and Potemkinskyi Islands. Elements of the Russian 61st Naval Infantry Brigade and soldiers of the 98th Guards Airborne Division, ambushed mercilessly in the dark waters of the river, were literally stunned by what hit them. Under the simultaneous effect of FPV drones and artillery fire, Russian units had no choice but to flee from these island zones. Ukrainian local media sources confirmed that Russian units fled from all 4 islands named Oleksiivskyi, Potemkinskyi, Krulikov, and Korabeliv. But even these units' escape routes were a nightmare in themselves, because Ukrainian mortar rounds, fired according to pre-planned millimetric coordinates, continued raining down. What Russian soldiers left behind that night was not just valuable military equipment. They also left behind the wreckage of their shattered perception of invincibility on the southern front. But the most striking and ironic aspect of this successful operation story didn't happen at the front line. Because while Ukraine's 34th Brigade was driving Russian units from the island zones, Putin was spotted in an interesting video frame claiming his soldiers were achieving success in the south. In front of cameras, Putin was asking his soldiers whether they were advancing in the Zaporizhia direction, trying to paint an image that everything on the southern fronts was working flawlessly. These video frames were truly recorded as a tragicomic moment, because for Russia, the real strings had already been cut not on those broad fronts Putin was talking about, but in those quiet, foggy river islands between Kherson and Oleshky. By seizing these critical islands, Kiev expanded the absolute fire control zone they created on the river's left bank to enormous dimensions. Now the Ukrainian army, thanks to the new surveillance and fire superiority provided by the islands, can see the Russian army's rear lines much more clearly. Critical Russian logistics centers, ammunition stores, and staging areas in Oleshky have now become the most exposed and defenseless targets of Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles and artillery batteries. One of the most striking consequences of these events was on the daily life of Russian soldiers in the area. Russian soldiers who previously reached Oleshky comfortably with armored vehicles and logistics trucks were completely deprived of their main supply routes with the loss of the islands. Ukraine's fire superiority shook Russian strongholds at critical connection points like the Potemkinskyi road bridge. Now, an ordinary Russian soldier, to reach his front line and position, must walk a full 20 to 30 kilometers carrying heavy equipment starting from Kostiantynivka. Additionally, with this operation, the Ukrainian army has guaranteed Kherson city against a possible Russian river crossing, and they are now pushing their defensive shields deep into enemy lines. Amid all these dizzying developments, a very critical question comes to mind. While Oleshky, a strong logistics center, was under Russian occupation, how could the Ukrainian army execute such a massive operation in this island zone right under their noses? Why couldn't Putin's army prevent Ukraine's advance despite the military occupation force it held in the area? The answer to this question is hidden directly in one of the Russian army's greatest disappointments in the south: the monumental collapse of the Dnipro River Fleet. The Russian Defense Ministry had established this river fleet in March 2024, with grand ambitions to control the Dnipro basin. The fleet's purpose was to patrol the island zone, provide logistics, and instantly block any possible Ukrainian infiltrations on the river. In Russia's military doctrine, river fleets were always depicted as an impassable steel wall blocking enemy infiltrations. Those famous Project 1204 Shmel-class patrol boats, transported from the Caspian Sea to Kherson waters with great hopes, with their heavy machine guns and armored structures, truly did look fearsome on paper. But the merciless and clear mathematics of modern warfare soon kicked in. These boats, produced with decrepit 1970s technology, clumsy in the water with extremely low maneuverability, were helpless against Ukrainian FPV drones, costing only a few $100s that dive at dozens of meters per second. According to United 24 media sources May reports, Russian forces had amassed more than 300 boats in the Kherson direction. The aim was to break Ukrainian defense lines by conducting amphibious operations. But this crowded boat fleet failed to deliver what was wanted. Ukraine's long-range missiles and high-explosive unmanned aerial vehicles began eroding this fleet step by step. The biggest breaking point had occurred much earlier than Russia's boat-gathering activities. In December 2025, when Ukrainian forces leveled the fleet's main base and radar facilities at Olenivka, Russia had already seen the first signs that it wouldn't get what it wanted in the Dnipro-Kherson direction. Because this heavy blow paralyzed the fleet's command and control capability and rendered most of the boats unusable. The few remaining fast Russian boats after this collapse turned into open floating targets for Ukrainian FPV drones. Reports leaked from the Atesh partisan movement from the area lay bare the panic in the Russian command echelon in all its nakedness. The boat shortage in the Russian army reached such a critical level that venturing onto the river now appears impossible for soldiers. According to Ukrainian partisan groups, evacuation teams were completely disbanded, and the last few intact boats began rotting from neglect. Ukraine's 34th Marine Brigade, when planning the June operation, analyzed Russia's blind spot, this indescribable helplessness on the waters, very well. Russia's ground units in Oleshky, because the river fleet collapsed, couldn't send any support to their comrades being ambushed on the islands just a few hundred meters away. This massive operation they could only watch helplessly from shore became the clearest proof of how Russia's combined warfare capability went bankrupt in the Kherson Delta. After all these events, Ukraine's island victories and the collapse of the Russian river fleet, the waters in the region appear unlikely to calm down. It's very clear that the Kiev administration sees this success not as a final stop, but as the starting point of new and much larger operations. In the coming period, the Ukrainian army's most critical target in this area may be using the momentum gained in the island zone to permanently expand bridgeheads on the left bank. In the first phase, Oleshky's outer neighborhoods and defense lines around the Konka River are expected to be kept under relentless pressure from Ukrainian artillery and lethal drones. The remnants of the already damaged Potemkinskyi bridge could be completely erased from the map, reducing to zero forever the possibility of the Russian army establishing even a makeshift logistics line. On the other hand, Ukraine's medium-term plans may also include creating a wedge through Hola Pristan and other small islands to the south to threaten supply lines extending to the Kinburn Peninsula. Because this strategy aims to completely narrow Russia's northern logistics corridors extending to Crimea and push the Black Sea Fleet's remnants even further south. But behind these tactical victories in the area lies a much more massive, continent-scale strategic siege. Advanced technology weapons like Ukraine's domestically produced Flamingo cruise missiles with a full 3,000-kilometer range, which Ukraine has been focusing on recently, enter the equation at precisely this point. While Russian units on the islands struggle with logistics crisis, the main supply bases, command centers, and Crimea connection roads kilometers behind them can be systematically erased from the map with these long-range missiles. In other words, the Ukrainian army is not only cutting the Russian military network at the very front of the line, it can also target the lines behind it from much deeper with strategic missile technologies. The possibility of the Russian army bringing fresh forces, armored vehicles, or new boats to this area has become incredibly difficult precisely thanks to deep strike capabilities like Flamingo. Any major Russian military shipment can be detected by satellites hundreds of kilometers away before it even reaches the Kherson front line. This asymmetric siege has put the Kremlin's military command echelon in Kherson into what amounts to clinical paralysis. Russian generals face the process of making a strategic withdrawal decision and demolishing Putin's invincible political image. So how much longer can the Russian army maintain its occupation of Oleshky and its surroundings under this pressure? The answer to how long this settlement can be held depends largely on how durable Russia's logistics lines extending to Crimea are. The systematic strikes Ukraine carries out with cruise missiles and medium-range drone systems are slowly strangling Russia's southern resupply network. The repeated damage to bridges and roads in the Chongar, Armyansk, and Henichesk directions forces Russia to constantly reorganize its material flow. These reorganizations create both time and resource losses. Additionally, the detail of how Ukraine used this latest operation in the Kherson-Oleshky direction as a testing ground is also very important. Because the 34th Brigade's success signals the birth of a new combat doctrine in the river delta for strategy developers in Kyiv. Instead of classical ground operations, the floating island chain concept now comes to the foreground. Ukrainian engineers may begin constructing rapid concrete shelters, solar-powered drone charging stations, and fiber-optic communication lines to transform captured islands into permanent fire support points. This infrastructure could create a template not just for Kherson, but for possible future river operations as well. On the other hand, the least discussed but most critical dimension of the operation is the leap in Ukraine's electronic warfare capabilities. Because what paralyzed Russia's Shmel-class boats was not just FPV drones. Ukraine's domestically produced Notch and Pokrova EW systems, activated simultaneously, scrambled Russian boats' navigation and radio communications for hours. This meant the Russian command chain could barely establish any contact with their units on the islands. This technological superiority prepares the ground for the Ukrainian army to make the drone, electronic warfare, and special forces triad a standard operating procedure. On the Russian side, the situation is evolving into a more complex psychological crisis. In recent weeks among Russian units in Kherson, increasing AWOL cases under the name of voluntary rotation are reportedly being recorded. This is actually not a morale problem unique to Kherson. It's an indicator that Russia is generally struggling to adapt to next-generation warfare. Despite the Kremlin's mobilization waves, the quality loss in professional marine and airborne units is becoming increasingly apparent. From an environmental perspective, the story is even more tragic. The Dnipro Delta ecosystem, already sensitized after the Kakhovka Dam destruction, is under new pressure from intensive ammunition use and fuel leaking from sunken boats. While the Ukrainian side deploys rapid environmental cleanup teams on captured islands, the Russian side completely ignores this issue. And perhaps the deepest impact of this operation may be the time factor. While Ukraine accelerates its pace to capitalize on the summer months, Russia is experiencing serious time loss in its winter preparation process. The loss of the islands could delay Russian fortification work planned for the left bank by at least 6 to 8 weeks. During this period, Ukraine could seize the opportunity to both consolidate its logistics superiority and bring new weapon systems online. The deployment of these new weapon systems doesn't just change the equation on land or water, it also adds an entirely new dimension to the power struggle in the sky. The Ukrainian army's relentless advance in the river delta should actually be read as the flawless groundwork of a much larger air-ground integration plan. Because pushing Russian artillery batteries and short-range air defense systems to Oleshky and beyond, much deeper, creates a massive safe corridor over the Dnipro River for the Ukrainian Air Force. Modern combat aircraft and advanced air assets, supplied by Western allies with integration accelerating, could come into play as a strategic shield at precisely this point. In other words, these floodplains and river basins could become a springboard from which Ukrainian jets could infiltrate at low altitude and drop precision munitions on Russia's strategic bases in the south. This situation carries enormous potential to deeply shake not just military logistics, but also the economic and geopolitical balances in the Black Sea's northwestern basin. If Ukraine manages to completely secure the Dnipro estuary area with the absolute fire superiority and new air umbrella it has achieved, key civilian infrastructure that has been idle since the start of the war could come back online. The realization of this scenario would open the door to two fundamental strategic objectives: Mykolaiv and Kherson ports. The possibility of these vital gateways to the Black Sea reopening to civilian maritime trade and international cargo ships is very important, because these ports could provide direct maritime shipment of Ukraine's agricultural and industrial products. In short, these river and island operations are far beyond an ordinary tactical territorial gain. It appears that the Kiev administration didn't just push enemy forces back in a geography surrounded by waters. They managed to drag the Russian army into the very center of a multi-layered, systematic paralysis on land, air, and strategic trade fronts simultaneously. This narrow river strip between Kherson and Oleshky has now turned into a laboratory where not just two armies, but two different concepts of warfare collide. Ukraine is not only gaining terrain here, it's also rewriting the rules of future river warfare. And Russia is finding it increasingly difficult to keep up with these rules. Now all focus is turned to the news of new storms coming from the dark and dangerous waters of the Dnipro. The coming weeks and months will likely show just how big a turning point these small islands truly were. So what do you think about this? Do you think the Ukrainian army can trigger a historic domino effect with its crushing pressure launched from these islands that could completely rip Russia from the left bank of Kherson? Or will Putin's units continue to hold on at any cost in these marshlands for Crimea's security, despite its depleted river fleet and collapsing logistics? We await your comments. To make your long drives more enjoyable, we also await you on Spotify, where we present our video content. Thank you for choosing us. Presented by TGN.